Hi there, and welcome to this week's lesson. So we are carrying on from last week. Last week we were looking at Dutch tonal painting, and I was also talking a bit about the Impressionists. And we've been looking at the way that colour relates to tonal value. So sometimes this isn't always obvious. So I talked a little bit about how normally you emphasise one over the other. So, the fact is that at the extreme ends of tonal value, white and black, they are effectively non-colours. So by colours, I'm talking about red, yellow, green, and all the sort of colours that come from that. So when you go to the extreme ends of tone with very light skies, very dark shadows, you do that at the expense of colour saturation. So one of the great discoveries of the Impressionist painters was the fact that you didn't need to use that whole tonal range. You could actually bring the tonal range a bit narrower, and you could create the effects of form and light and shadow by using colour as well as tone. Okay, and with great effect, it creates quite a different feeling to the paintings. Okay, so what I'm going to do this week is my demonstration. I'm going to be focusing more on the Impressionists, and we'll just have a look, a bit of a recap on Photoshop. I'll talk through some of the theory and give you some suggestions for your own painting this week. And then I say on Wednesday I'll do a demonstration using the same reference from last week, but done with these Impressionist ideas in mind. Okay, so that's the plan. So let's go over to Photoshop and have a bit of a recap. Okay, so we just start looking at these Dutch painters again. So as we can see, what we were looking at here is their emphasis was tonal value. Okay, was sort of strong contrast. So if I look at it black and white, okay, clear, strong contrast. So that's what we learned from the Dutch painters. Also, their use of these spotlights to sort of pull the eye around a composition. Somewhat artificial. I mean, you know, you can see these effects in nature, but here more deliberately used as a compositional device. So we looked at this one, Jacob van Riese, which I really liked, with this spotlight in the middle of the painting. And this one here, Peter de Molyen. Okay, so muted colours, earth tones, much more subdued. Okay, so this week we're going on to the Impressionists. So here we are, this is Renoir, okay, who was very keen of these sorts of urban scenes with people involved in a conversation. I've mentioned this before, in the film Amelie there's a chap and he can't go outdoors, and he spends all his time sort of repainting this Renoir one, and he's particularly interested in the expressions of the people. You know, this chap is looking at this chap and he's looking at her and she's looking off into the distance. So it's sort of, you know, you try to wonder what's the dynamics going on between these people. Anyway, so it's interesting from that point of view. But what we're interested in is, so with the Impressionists, I dare say this is still quite a tonal painting. Okay, if we look at it black and white. Okay, so it does still work on a sort of tonal level. It goes quite dark here. But in particular is this, we start to see the use of blue in the shadows. Okay, now the fact is, if we were standing there, we have to assume it probably wasn't as blue as this. So this is a device being used by Renoir, and you'll notice that all his blacks, his shadows, are erring towards blue, and where he's got his light, he is using oranges. Okay, so we can see a few clues as to what we're going to be doing in this painting. Particularly look at these little dots of yellow. So we can see, although Renoir in his detailed areas they're quite tight, we start to see something a bit like this sort of pointillist approach. And I've got this painting by Sorolla, who was a Spanish artist, and there was a show on last year in London, I think, with some of his work. And I picked this one out particularly because, again, we can see this very clever use of blue shadows and slightly orange colours in the light. So Sorolla was excellent at painting these sort of white cloth, which you would think is a relatively sort of unpromising subject until you realise, you know, all the colour that goes into it. And it's almost like the, you know, obviously his handling of the faces is excellent and the drawing is excellent, but the way he finds colour in these whites is something we can really learn from. So down here we can see almost green coming in. So what's happening is where the light, where the white dress is being picked up in the light is going towards yellow-orange. And then in this shadow, it's picking up the blue sky. And it gives this feeling of light and luminosity. If you took away some of that saturation, okay, it would still work, but you wouldn't get any. You see, actually what you notice by desaturating it is the tonal contrast between the blue and the white is actually incredibly subtle, okay? But because he's got the saturation of the blue and the white high, we get the effect. So again, it's another example where he's not relying so much on tonal contrast. Look at her dress. You can see the white there is actually, it's less white than here. So again, it's not actually properly going up to pure white. The dog also, the dog isn't white, if you notice, compared to this light here. So there's some clever things going on there, tricks of the eye. You'd think that dog is a white dog, and that could really get people into difficulty painting it too white. It would pull the eye. Okay, so that's Sorolla. And then this was a Monet that we looked at. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to, technical points I want us to concentrate on this week. So firstly, we'll see that Impressionism led into something called Pointillism, but you can see the roots of it here. If we go up close, we can start to see that Monet has created this incredible feeling of light, and a lot of it is achieved not with white paint, but with the clever use of colours side by side, okay? So this relates somewhat to the idea of optical mixing, which we'll have a look at what, I'll show you some pointillist paintings that illustrate this point more. But this is like the clever use of, you see these areas are glowing. The whole thing has this feeling of glow, and it's about putting interesting colours side by side. So in the shadows here, we have these cool purpley greys beside these bright greens, okay? And that works well. And in the lights, we have oranges beside purpley blues. So if you know about complementary colours, you know that blue and orange are opposites. When they're side by side, they actually, well, they complement each other, but they reinforce each other and give you very strong, they make the colours glow. So it's a, and we can see that here. So it's not explicitly using complementary colours, but it's in the haystack here, we see warm and cool. So these warm greens and these cool purples, okay? So there's some very clever mixing of colours. You can also see, as a sort of precursor to pointillism, you can see how the paint is treated with smaller dashes of paint. So there's not much blending going on here. The effects are created by just basically layering on paint one brush stroke at a time. And this creates the fact that everything wasn't blended together. Again, you could see this in like Cézanne and Pointillism. It starts to, you're sort of fragmenting the world, and it gives the painting a sort of energy. So that's one of the technical things that I'm going to try and show you in my demonstration, is to start to think more in terms of small chunks of colour side by side, as opposed to large areas where you're blending. In watercolours, I say this relates to the idea of mingling. So you're mingling colours together. Instead of mixing them, you put them on the page and allow sort of them to mingle together and create these very nice effects. So to illustrate that, I'm just going to show you a Charles Reade picture. So there's another point I was going to make, which was this is a really useful theory for both oils and watercolours. And what it says is either put colour into your shadows or into your lights. So last week I pulled up a tonal scale. And as I said at the beginning, you can't have colour in both. So in this case, what Charles Reade has done is the light, the whites of the piece are basically left as white. So they're a non-colour. Everything else though is, it reads as dark, but actually it's a mid-value apart from these bits in the tree. Okay. So you can see tonally it works. But what he's basically got here is a dark figure against a dark ground. But within that simple tonal pattern, he's put all these minglings. So we can see different colours just being dropped in, some smaller splashes of red and blue. This creates interest around this area. Okay, so it's a really clever one to do, is to analyze your painting in terms of light and dark. Okay, so this comes from in Kevin McPherson's book, which some of you may have seen. He recommends an exercise where you take a motif for painting some reference, and you can paint it one time where you put colour in the light shapes and keep the darks neutral, so you can do blacks and umbers. But in another one, put your colour in your shadows. But in that case, keep the lights just white or grey white, so desaturated. So one or the other will make for a better painting. Okay, so that's another bit of theory. So let's go on to... So this is Sorolla. So Pointillism isn't quite Impressionism, but hopefully you can see it's it relates to it. So this is Sorolla, famous for his pictures of people sitting by the Seine, sunbathing. And so this painting is made up of lots of dots of colour. So this is one of the theories that came out of Impressionism, and I say at the time it probably came out of printing and photography. But what they discovered is that when you put colours side by side, your brain will mix them. So you can see this effect on TV screens, for example. Just use green, blue and red. They're the primary colours of light, which is a bit different than pigment. You can also see the effect in printing, a printing press. So if you look at a photograph in a magazine under a microscope, you will see it's broken down into lots of coloured dots. And what's happening out of those coloured dots is your eye is mixing the colour. Okay, so it creates a different feel than just mixing paint. Okay, so we can see in this background, Sorolla, he's got green and he's got red. Okay, so we know they're complementary colours. So by putting them in the background, he's actually deliberately he's creating the feeling of the whole painting glowing. And I think that's what they particularly liked. It was this glowing effect. Also, it's very interesting because, you know, close up it breaks down, it's just dots, and yet from a distance it reads really well. Okay, so when we're thinking about, if I go back to if I go back to this one, say, so you can put down quite unusual colours. In this case, like we've got some green beside purple beside blue, and we can trust that our eye, from a distance, our eye is going to mix these colours and make sense of them, you see. And this is why it's important to look at colour. So obviously most people would say, well, a haystack isn't blue, and it certainly isn't purple, you know, it's a sort of yellow colour. That's where Monet, that's what he was interested in, was looking at the way that colour changes under different lighting conditions. So in order to see that, you have to look beyond any of your sort of preconceived ideas about what colour a thing is, and really become interested in it. It particularly becomes interesting at these, you know, here we are with the sunset. So when the light is low, there's going to be more colour in the in a scene, and that means these observations become sort of easier. Okay, so yeah, lots of little bits of colour, even colours that don't make sense going side by side. That's something we are going to have a look at in our demonstrations. Okay, so there's Sorolla again. Now this is a Van Gogh. He was around when people were talking about pointillism, and like, you know, probably I might have done the same thing if I was there at the time, is you hear a good idea or you want to give it a go. And here he's given it a go with actually great effect. It's actually got, it's more luminous in some respects than some of the Seurat ones. So I really like what he's done here. And in particular, look at this background, basically greens, blues and oranges. And the effect is it almost glows. I'm sure to see this painting, you know, it would almost feel alive. And as you know, Van Gogh, he did like this, it's like not quite pointillism, but he did like this effect where each brush stroke sort of stood. He didn't blend, he let each stroke sort of stand on its own. So that is another sort of aspect of it. And also it would have broken him away and other artists away from the idea of literal colour to more sort of a felt sense of colour. So putting on that red, you know, that was a sort of intuitive response to the colours, and you know, in this case it's worked really well. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting example of it. But yeah, little dots of colour. And then, okay, so this is a close-up of a demonstration. So I'm going to put a link down below to a woman, a video that I saw ages ago, and I've done her lesson based, sort of inspired by her lesson in my classes a few times. And this is, it's not a very good reproduction of one of my demo sort of pieces that I did at the beginning of my classes. And it's talking about Impressionist ways of painting. So this one at the top here, this is what I'm going to be interested in this week. So this is a bit more like the Van Gogh approach. This one on the side here, that's like what I think she refers to as a mosaic approach. It's more towards pointillism, and the idea is letting every brush stroke stand on its own. Okay, so that's one approach. This one, the first one, is called colour breaking, and the idea here is more apparent in the background. Is you still let the tonal values, they stay as a constant, but within those tonal values you can break the colour. So you can go from blue to red to black. As long as the tonal value stays constant, you're still going to get the same effect. Okay, So I say I'll put the link, you can watch that if you're interested, but as long as you've got the basic idea, is you stick to the tonal mass, and then you can play around with the colours. So I'll tell you what, I'm just going to do a quick demonstration for you of this idea. Okay, so I thought I would just do a quick, a few quick little paintings just to try and illustrate some of these points. So first was the idea of the tonal values, sort of leaving, we'll do an apple. Now, if I do something like this, like that. Okay, so that's a tonal description of an apple. So I've left the white out. So what I can do is I've sort of said that the lights are going to be a non-color. But that means as long as so if that tonal pattern works, let's say I put in some background as well. Okay, so with the optical mixing, I can put various colors in. Just so maybe even. So that can all have, as long as that color doesn't matter because it's all representing a dark tone, okay? But also the shadow color can also have various, as long as it stays dark, it doesn't really matter, okay? But we're trying to create some luminosity, so having like complementaries like that might help as well, okay? So we can put all sorts in there. So as long as we say keep that tonal structure, we're going to have something that's going to sort of work. So I'll just so that would be a bit like the mingling idea, is we can put lots of different colours in and it should still read, okay? Let's create that little stalk. So that would be a, that's like an Impressionist idea, but I say I've left the lights white. So an alternative approach is we can keep the shadows a non-colour. So we could still have it blue, but in this case it's going to be more of a desaturated blue. Okay, and that would be like that. Okay, that's the shadow. So now what I can do is, those are my shadow shapes. So now I can put colour in there. Okay, and as I said last week, maybe not going to white, so I could swap out the white for some yellow. Okay, and again with colour breaking, I can change that colour. I can put other colours in. As long as it stays, as long as I keep the tonal pattern, I'm okay. And we could do the same with the background. We could put in various colour back there. So this one, colour in the lights, more muted in the darks, okay? So that's the principle there. So again, it depends what your scene. If your scene is mostly shadow, then it would make sense to put the colour in the shadows and leave the lights white. But again, if it's primarily a white, you know, a very bright painting, and say watercolours are often like this, like skies and water, you keep them light, but then put the colour in your darks, which might be your boats or your sort of shadows, that sort of thing. Okay. So they're those two ideas. Okay, so I was asked about, sometimes it's not obvious where to start with these sorts of paintings. So I'm just gonna, I'll get some reference material. Let's have a look. Okay, so I've got a picture of Felixstowe Docks here. And as you can see, it's more, if I go up a bit closer to it, it's a bit of a small image. It is a tonal painting, okay? So, or it's a tonal photograph in that it's working more on the area of black and white. Now, if I wanted to treat this in a more impressionist style, I'm just going to see what I can do to change it. So I might lighten the darks. Okay, so that might be one thing. Lighten the darks. Move the whole thing more to a mid value. Okay. And then increase the saturation. So something like that, that would give me more clues from a, you know, where I might go if this was an impressionist painting. So in the, we've got this nice effect here, which I've told you before. This is where the light is bleeding past a wall or something like that, diffraction, and it creates that yellow glow. So that could be obviously exaggerated. But, you know, I would be thinking of it in terms of, let's say, so maybe this one suggests purples, purpley colours in the shadows, okay? So maybe purples, this could all be purples and blues. So let's say we got purples and blues. Again, this is just, so purples and blues represent the shadows. And then with these foreground bushes maybe going more towards a sort of, you know, something a bit lighter or more warmer for the lights, okay? So you see I'm doing the colour breaking idea. With the sky as well, the sky, in this case, the sky is quite light, so probably, again, maybe just playing with warm and cool, and I would, you know, I would include the colour, not that, you know, perhaps greens, but try to keep, you know, keep the colours interesting and little dots of colour side by side, okay? And play around with it. So remember, what you're trying to do is the colours are going to mix in your eye, so you have to keep stepping back to see what they look like, okay? And then you're going to sort of like, and you're sort of intuitively putting colours side by side to see what happens, to see what creates the mood and the atmosphere of nature, okay? But yeah, as a rule, make the shadows cool. So this is why I'm using these purples and blues. Okay, and obviously I wouldn't go as blue as that in the light. We'll keep all that. That's quite a nice complementary colour though. So maybe, you know, even if you had little bits of complementary, that might not be awful. But you know, you still have to keep the structure of the painting working. Like so. You see how it all starts to fragment, but it can create very nice effects. Yeah, so blues and cools in the shadows, purples, and then warmer colours in the lights, even though this is a bit of a desaturated colour in reality. So maybe pinks. Now if I want that to be grey, I'm going to put in cooler colour beside it. And that's going to mix optically in your eye and sort of start to something like that. Okay, so you can sort of have fun with it, but again, you're trying these things out and seeing what happens, and just becoming interested also in how the colors react when they are side by side. Okay. So that's what I'd like you to have a go at this week. Take some of these ideas, get some reference material. You can repeat the one you did last week. If it helps, you know, play around with it on your phone or on your tablet. Play around with saturation. That might give you some suggestions how to push the colour. Remember though, I was saying in the Impressionist, we're not going to go black. So that's why I'm using these purples and blues. In the same way, I wouldn't want to go really as white as that for the sun, okay? For an Impressionist painting, I would knock that sun back a bit. Maybe, you know, a little bit of yellow there. So I would be really trying to rely more on colour to do the work than on white. Okay, because it's easy to put a white sun there, but how do we get the same effect just by using colour? So that would be how I would be sort of thinking about it. Okay, if it helps, also look at some, you know, I'm sure you might have books or you can look online, look at Impressionist painting, look at how they treated these little brush strokes like chunks, and see if you can have a go with that as well. Okay. So I'm looking forward to Wednesday. I'm going to have a go at this myself and try and put one together. And you can send me them in, and then we'll have a look at the end of the week and see what everyone has done. Anyway, so hope you enjoyed that. Look forward to seeing what you get up to. If you've got any questions, you can always email me or put them in the comments below. And I will see you later in the week. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.